Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here for my Friday reads. The only thing I finished in its entirety this week was the short story that begins the second volume of my Honoré de Balzac set called A Study of Woman. But I'm going to reserve my thoughts on this for a separate video that I'll be filming on the weekend. I did continue on with Rebel Women Between the Wars by Sarah Lonsdale. I read the second chapter in here, which is about an English Quaker woman. And there's a quote in here that I thought was quite fun that I wanted to share. Francesca Wilson was a woman who went about involving herself in relief work through unconventional means and through unofficial channels. So she was brought up in England in a Quaker family, but she didn't necessarily believe all the religious aspects of the community she grew up in, but she was definitely a Quaker culturally and socially, and despite perhaps not believing in God, as the author suggests here, she was very devoted to helping people. But because she was a little bit on the unconventional side and was perhaps dreaming of adventure rather than going out to, serve and do things without selfishness, she was rejected by the committee who was selecting young women to go and to serve. And so she showed up at the relief camp on her own, and given her skill set, they took her. So she sort of got in through a back channel, and she made a life's work out of helping people. And she taught people to farm, she taught boys skills, she did nursing work of sorts. But as the author says here, she smoked, swore mildly, and took rum in her tea. She spoke Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, Serbian, and Russian, quickly learning the language of every new country she arrived in. And so she goes to Spain, she goes to Serbia, she goes all over Europe, doing somewhat unconventional relief work. And the author does take her story as proof that between the wars, women were, pushing that feminist cause by going through unconventional channels, but mostly, in the case of many other women, they did it through the men that they knew. So through a father or a husband or a brother, they would obtain a higher position within an organization. And usually you needed a man in your life, essentially, to attain that position, to attain that position within a charity organization like that. But this woman here was the exception. So that was quite interesting. And then I decided to pick up a biography of Hegel by Terry Pinkard. And I purchased this Terry Pinkard one because it was the only one available to purchase on Amazon when I was looking to read some more about Hegel. I'm thinking of diving into some of Hegel's works, and I wanted the biographical background before I dive back into that. Enjoying it so far, just a few chapters in, about 50 pages, so I won't say much about this yet. It's very interesting to hear that he was influenced by Rousseau early in his life, and that he didn't have much of an interest in Kant early in his life, despite the fact that we often associate him as being the successor to Kant. So it'll be interesting to hear how he actually picks up that interest. And then I am working my way through the novel by Schmidt as a buddy read with Hannah, and Sean D. Standfast has also joined us. We've read the first 2 chapters so far, and I'm quite enjoying it. It's actually the sort of book that I think it's good to take in little bits and pieces. So we've read the prologue in the introduction where the author tries to define what a novel is, and it is a little bit of an unsatisfying introduction because he essentially comes to the conclusion that the novel is not something that we really have a solid definition for. He looks at, the dictionary definition of a work of fiction of some length, but then says, maybe this is a novel, maybe that is a novel, and leaves us hanging, I guess, to decide for ourselves. And he talks a bit about the blurred line between fiction and nonfiction, and can a novel be nonfiction, and are some of those early works of British literature actually novels, despite the fact that in their day they were described as nonfiction. So travel literature, for instance, travel literature that in its day was meant or marketed as something that was true, and perhaps the people reading it thought it was true, and maybe even the author thought that the things he was describing were true, but perhaps the author had never actually traveled anywhere and had just taken hearsay and stories from other people, and so you end up with these very fantastical travel narratives full of events and people and places that are certainly fictitious. And I came across a few titles in here I had never heard of. Manderville's Travels, for instance. That's sort of the context of what I just mentioned. Manderville's Travels was a work composed in French in the 14th century, but printed into English in the 15th century, and it was certainly meant to be true, but from our perspective, looking at it, we realize, a lot of that is absolute bullshit. It's definitely fiction. And so does it qualify as a novel? And Schmidt says, well, maybe, and leaves us hanging there. And when we get into the second chapter, titled True Stories, he talks about medieval England and decides to place the birth of the novel as we know it within medieval England, and looks at sort of the emergence of the Protestant religion and Protestantism, and ties the written works around that time that sort of resemble the novel to that shift. And he looks at the novel as something that could sort of support the establishment of a religion, and also something that can sort of rebel against that religion. And so he looks at the Book of Martyrs, which was meant to sort of counter the Catholic Lives of Saints. And the Book of Martyrs certainly had all these stories about Protestant spiritual people who were martyred, and it was meant to inspire people and to support that worldview. But as you would expect in a Book of Martyrs, the author was somewhat fast and loose with the truth, and everything had a bias and was supporting that particular worldview. And so you wonder, is it a novel? Is it a work of nonfiction? Is there a difference? And I think I'm quite excited to continue on with this book and with the buddy read. And so that is what I'm up to this week. Probably going to only read the Hegel biography this weekend, unless I get distracted from that and pick up something else on my shelf that I still have on the go. I'm still working my way through Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I may return to that this weekend as well. I hope you're having an excellent Friday, and I hope you have a great weekend.